My name is Stephanie Brubaker. I'm an ex-Google engineer. I actually do full stack development, but if I had to pick one part of the system to work on, it would definitely be the front end. I currently work at Full Story, which is a local Atlanta startup. We've been around about 3 or 4 years now. I'll show some examples from Full Story just because that's where I've used D3 the most, but feel free to talk to me afterwards if you're interested in what we do. Has anyone here actually used D3 before? Oh, so a good number of folks. Nice. All right. Well, why am I giving this talk? No, kidding. So I'm going to run through some of the scenarios where you want to do D3 and actually use it for your visualizations, but actually I would like to start with what D3 is not and when you don't want to use it. Because D3 is a lot of work to put in. If you've worked with it, you are familiar with that part of it. So I'd like to talk about some of the scenarios first where you're better off using a different tool. All right, D3 is not a full service charting tool. If you want basically to take a large data dump or data stream and just visualize it for your own internal use, you are far better off using something like Chartio, Data Hero, Sumall, Tableau if you have deep pockets. There are lots of tools out there that are hosted services that are going to actually visualize your data for you, and that will be far less effort and basically just as useful as using D3. It is also not a charting library. So there are charting libraries out there like Chart.js, Google Charts. So if you want something that's a full service charting library, which is going to do most of the heavy lifting for you, D3 is not that. And it's also not a graphics layer. You may use something like Raphael, which actually has its own graphics primitives built on top of the native SVG primitives. D3 is not that. It uses all of the native browser primitives to do the rendering. There are a lot of great reasons for that, but if you're looking for something that's simplified, that is not what D3 is. All right, so what is it? So the definition on the site is that it's a JavaScript library for manipulating documents based on data. And at its core, that's what D3 is. You define your data set, and you define how you want that data to actually map to browser primitives, and it does the mapping for you. The number one thing it does is just bind data to the DOM. And I'm going to show an example that looks nothing like a graph or a chart or anything like that, but it basically just lets you define how you want primitives to bind to the DOM. It does codify some display layouts, so it has some shorthand for creating things like pie charts, bar charts, etc. But these things, remember, are also still written in the native SVG layout, and you can actually modify them the same way you would if you were writing this all by hand. And it also enables data-driven transforms. If you want to do fairly complex transformations with data over time, or transform from one graph type to another, then it makes it very, very easy to actually transform the visualization that is tied to your data, or transform the underlying data set that you're using. All right, so why would you want to use D3 if it's so much work? There are 3 main reasons. The first is that it avoids proprietary data models. Why is that nice? Well, because I don't have to wait for the next version of D3 to come out in order to use all of the up-to-date browser primitives that are coming out. So if I want to use a Flexbox, I can use Flexbox as soon as it's added to the spec. It also has minimal overhead because it is built right on top of the native browser elements. So it is about as fast as you can get without building everything yourself. And finally, it balances leverage with control. If you don't care a lot about exactly what your chart is going to look like, use a charting library. It's going to be way easier. But if you want extremely fine-grained control over how those charts look and how they transition, then D3 is the way to go. All right, so let's look at some examples of what D3 can do, and then I'll talk in a little more detail about some of the core concepts. So this is the demo reel that Mike Bostock has on his site. And it's basically just running through the Apple, Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft stock prices for some period of time and overlaying that in different ways. So he runs through some stacked bar charts, stream graphs, pie charts, bar charts, etc. So as you can see, you can take the same data and very easily render it in a lot of different formats. All right, here's a really different looking visualization, and this is where I think this drives home the fact that you're just binding data to the DOM, and the representation that you come up with can look not like what you might imagine. So this is Mike Bostock, one of the creators of D3, works for the New York Times. He creates a lot of great visualizations for them, and this is something that he built for New York Fashion Week. So it gives you a nice kind of play-by-play of all of the models for each of the designers, and then he actually generated some nice color fingerprint representations of what each designer's designs look like. All right, and D3 can even do things that are data-driven, not just from data sets that you're providing to it, but from data sets that are created through interactions with your page. So this is a toy example, but you can imagine wanting to be able to do a visualization that actually is tied to mouse tracking. It uses all of the native primitives for things like mouse overs and so forth, so you can actually do nice visualizations related to how you're interacting with the DOM. All right, so let's get into a few of the highlights as far as core concepts in D3. D3 is massive, the API is huge, you should definitely go and look through the docs to see what else is in there. I'm just going to cover kind of my three-phase on what the concepts are of D3. The first one that always comes up is selections. Has anyone here ever been thrown off by the way D3 does selections? I saw one hand. I think some other folks are just not admitting it. Because I know when you first get into it, going back to the set theory that Bob was talking about, some folks get really thrown off by how selections work. So basically, as you're transforming your data, there are going to be three data sets that you've created. So imagine that you've initialized your page with some data. Now you've got a second data set coming in, and you want to replace the original data with this second data set. What you've got is three unique partitions. The first one is all of the elements in your second data set that didn't exist in the first one. That's your enter set, because you have to actually create new DOM elements to deal with them. The second partition is elements that already existed but might have updated values. That's your update set. And finally, your exit set is all of those elements that were in the first data set but don't appear in the second, and therefore they're going to be removed from the DOM. And you can actually define custom transitions for all of these data sets. So let's take a look at a very basic code sample. What's happening in this sample is, on each iteration, a random subset of the alphabet is being chosen. Entering elements are colored in green, and they fall in from the top. Updated elements are in black, and they just compress or expand in order to make room for the elements that are entering and exiting. And exiting elements are shown in red. I think technically it's brown in this code, but it looks red to me. And those fall out of the bottom of the data set. So let's take a quick minute to see. It is not a lot of code that's generating this visualization. If we kind of skip to the good part, at the very bottom here is where it's basically just taking a random data set, a random shuffling of the alphabet, taking the first, some random number, sorting them, and then passing that into this update function. So update is our magical method that is going to make the animation happen. All right, so what happens here? Well, in update, the first thing we do is we just initialize our text selection with the data that was passed in. Now, as you can see, he's defined the 3 sets that I talked about a minute ago, and he's defined transformations for each one. So for updates, if a character is just going to stay in the data set, all that needs to happen to it is it needs to transition to the right position along the x-axis. So there's this attribute x. He's defined a function based on the element value and based on its index in the input array, and he's just going to position it along that x-axis. The enter selection is just slightly more complicated because he's actually going to append, actually in that first selection, he also did add a class to it, the update class, and that just defines the color of the elements, basically. The enter selection actually appends a brand new text element to any entering elements. It positions them actually right above where the text is going to finish. It does the exact same transformation in the x-axis to position it laterally in the right spot. They start essentially invisible. Text value is set to whatever that character is. And then they transition over 750 milliseconds to actually drop into place and become fully opaque. And finally, the exit criterion, or the exit selection. For each exiting element, he's just going to do a brief transition after he sets the class, turns them red. He's going to do a brief transition to actually have them drop out of the bottom of the list of characters, style them to essentially be invisible, and then remove the element from the DOM. So pretty straightforward, and you get a nice smooth animation of those 3 sets. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is some of the rendering primitives. D3 is not a charting library, but it does make it easier to do some of the computation related to creating primitives in things like charts and graphs. And there are 2 things that you really need to know up front in order to use them in your visualizations. The first is layouts. So D3 has a bunch of built-in layouts. Some of them are things that you might see in a traditional, boardroom portfolio of visualizations like pie charts or stacked bar charts. But it also has things like forest diagrams, tree maps, and some more complex visualizations that you may want to use. If we actually look at what the API does for these layouts, it's really doing precisely what you would do, but it's doing a little bit more of the math for you. So instead of having to calculate what the angles are going to be for every slice in your pie, if you just declare that this is a pie layout and then pass in your data, it will figure out what portion of the pie should be allocated to each element. You can set comparators. You can specify starting and ending angles if you don't want a full circle in your pie chart. So it's a pretty small API, but very specific to pie charts. The second notion is scales. So typically, if we're making some kind of graph, we need to have a scale on which to transform the data. And the 3 classes of scales are quantitative scales, which are really for numerical input domains, ordinal scales, which can be essentially arbitrary strings that you want to create as a scale, and time scales. And I'm going to show a few examples of these so you can see what I mean. All right, so this is our app. This is full story. Actually, this whole central layout is generated through D3. New items just kind of come in from the top, everything shifts down. This is a user session list, so if someone who is lower down on the list logs in again, they'll pop back up to the top. So it really provides some nice animations for you just by binding your data to the DOM. But what I want to look at is some of the charts that we've created. So first off, we have a line graph, and you may have noticed that actually there's nothing explicit in the D3 API for line graphs. That's because literally this is just an SVG line. There's nothing special here. The magic is in the scales that I've defined. So along the bottom, I have a time scale, which is the actual dates on which my samples were taken. And then along the side, I have a quantitative scale for the y-axis. And so basically, I just defined a bunch of data with points in those two axes, and D3 draws an SVG line to correspond to it. Most of the data for these charts looks very similar, but you can render it essentially however you want, just by choosing a different layout for D3. This is showing a distribution of users, are they on desktop, tablet, mobile, etc. If I want to change the time scale, it'll actually remove pie slices or add them back in order to compensate. And it really creates some really nice, smooth animations. This is a nice example of an ordinal scale. So the x-axis is a numeric scale or a quantitative scale. The y-axis is an ordinal scale, where we're showing what the top browsers were for this set of users. So I've defined the three strings, Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. Those really aren't going to change unless someone logs in with IE. And it will just automatically reshuffle the data as I change the time frame. So you can see basically, if you select the right scales, then you can just drop in your data into whatever layout you're looking for, and it will just make it work. All right, the last thing I want to talk a little bit about is transitions. So D3 has a lot of built-in algorithms for doing transitions. You can kind of examine what the library looks like. We saw some transitions in that initial demo with the enter, exit, and update criteria, or selections rather. But D3 has essentially all of the interpolation algorithms that you would expect to see. You know, polynomials, various cubics, splines, etc. So you can just choose from the default D3 libraries, or if you want to define your own functions. You can define tweening functions for attributes like opacity. Sorry, for styles like opacity, and for attributes. So depending on, like for example, my pie chart, I was modifying the size of the pie, but I didn't want it to just snap from one size to the next. So as the data transitioned, I defined my own tweening function to say, here's how quickly I want you to transition. You know, I'd like some easing on either end and so forth. And so I basically gave it a custom function that I wanted it to use in order to modify those values. Generally, the transitions are pretty good. I would say the pie charts are pretty wonky, so you're far better off defining your own transitions. All right. So in general, if you're trying to visualize a data set, D3 is going to be the right choice if you want really fine-grained control of what your data visualization, layout, and styles look like, as well as transitions, and if you're willing to invest in learning a library, because it is getting a basic visualization up and running is very fast. Tweaking it so it looks exactly the way you want it takes a lot of investment to actually dig through the libraries and find the API pieces that you want. The D3JS website has some really great docs, actually, for what the API can do, lots of great examples. If you're looking for examples of things, Mike Bostock's site is by far the best place to look. Blocks has D3 submissions from all different authors. but Mike Bostock, as one of the authors and also as the primary user of D3, has by far the best demos. So if you're looking for an example of something specific, he also is extremely engaged in the community. So if you have a question or you're trying to do something that's very specific and you can't find an example of it, he's always happy to chat. And if you want to get in touch with me, my email is stephanie@fullstory.com. I'm going to hand it over to Laurel, who's going to take us to the next level.
Now that Stephanie has told you when not to use D3, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why to use D3, or another way to put this would be, let's abuse D3 for fun and profit. So, most of the use cases for D3 fall into, broadly, 3 categories. Once you have, yes, invested that time in learning it, you can absolutely use, some people might say misuse, D3 as a graphics library. It is a quick solution. And when would we do this? If what we're going to do easily fits into one of those known models. If what we're doing is fundamentally driven by data. If what we're doing involves a lot of moving pieces. So, of course, the beautiful element here is that D3 is built right on top of HTML, CSS, SVG. We can manipulate everything in its most suitable manner. That means if you drop it in your site, if there are existing CSS styles, it's going to fit right in. Now, anyone in here mess with CSS animation at all? Okay. Is it a headache? Yeah. Is it highly performant? No. You get more than 1, maybe 2 animations on a page. Yeah. We don't see that problem with D3. Yes, there is a performance barrier when you hit a very large number of elements. You have to work very hard to get to that threshold. On actually an old site, we threw together a demo that had about 150 elements in a force diagram, just to prove a point. Silky smooth performance, not something you're going to see with CSS. Now, I am skating through this kind of quickly. I just want to throw out, specifically referring to animations here, not transitions, completely different things. If you're not real sure about the difference, we can talk about it after. Another reason you would use this versus an animation, back to data, the ability to set arbitrary or random locations. Not something you can easily do without plugging a library in somewhere. This is just a straightforward zoom transition. It's picking a random location, going back and forth. You know, it might be something you would use as a background element. It's just that visual element. And I'm actually going to throw a little something else in here. Let's see if this works. Okay, well, moving on, and we'll come back to that if it loads. course, the weight, if you have a fairly simple animation, something you want to build, let's take one of the whiteboard videos. Quick demos that are very popular, you're going to have less weight versus using a video. Again, depends on the context, depends on what you're doing with it, but that's an option. But there is another really important reason to use D3 when you're displaying visual representations of data on your site. And that reason is accessibility. This is built on top of SVG. Okay, let's jump back to this real quick since it's up here. So, I said if what you're displaying easily fits a known model. Again, this is another demo. A client had a product list, features. I was not permitted to touch the copy or the list. He explicitly wanted to snow his clients with hundreds of features. And it worked very well for him. So, what on earth am I going to do with this to actually make it workable? It took me about 5 minutes to do this. And that was basically using search and insert to turn the features list into JSON. It fits a known model. It is data-driven, and the animations, the transitions are handled. I didn't touch anything except converting the data to JSON and telling it that I wanted it to be a pie chart. Okay. We'll get to that shortly. Back to accessibility. So, we're working with vector graphics. That's an important step right there. It means that whatever you're doing is zoomable. Critical component for usability, critical component for visual accessibility. We're working on top of standards. That means we're going to be compliant with whatever assistive tech people are using. We're not starting from a position of non-compliance. But the critical thing here, and we're back to just binding data to elements. We can tell the browser what each visual element represents. So SVG alone gives you title and description. That's already a little better than using an image, right? Image, we have the alt. SVG, we have a title. You can go to the title. It fills it out with an actual description of what this is. Then we can start getting into ARIA. You can apply ARIA roles to each of your paths. For example, let's say you have a chart with 3 data lines. You can apply an ARIA role to each of those lines, describing what is going on with that data. That will be read out in the screen reader. The data is fully accessible without you having to be able to see it. Now, there are still some considerations you need to be aware of. D3 will not magically make focus management work for you, but it does allow you to do it. That's still a little bit of a pain. Anyone who has worked with focus management will probably agree that There isn't a single great method right now once you get beyond very simple, straightforward things. And that is critical for signaling actions. It's critical for navigation. It, of course, affects how you can navigate things in a reader. If you're using something other than a mouse, if you're using a keyboard or voice or a head mouse, then you need to be able to see what is selected because you do not necessarily have that pointer on screen. So, straightforward graphics, animations, accessibility. So, let's talk about the second big group of things you can do with D3. And this really doesn't relate so much to its display functionality. You can use D3 to acquire new data from your users. So, this is the simplest possible example of this. It's set up to only allow one kind of path. It's essentially a whiteboard proof of concept. There are fully featured examples available. Right now, most of them are subscription only. However, this is actually not too difficult to do. Going back to that mouse tracking Stephanie was talking about earlier. Now, what's the utility of this? Well, you put this up. You can dump this into a ping. You can dump it into a PDF, let your users download it. That's a useful app right there. Another way you can use D3 to acquire new data is using it for configuration. Very simple, faster, easier, and more conformant than any other solution I'm immediately aware of. If you take a little longer with it, this is exactly the same thing, but it's had some transitions added in. We now have that really nice action on the handle. Makes it feel smoother. Ironically, tends to make it feel faster to users. You know, if you go in, you test them side by side. Makes it more fun to use. Or, here's a fairly common one. And, we've got an error blocking. There we go. Okay. Color picker. This is a selection of known palettes, but you can base this really with anything. Whether you put up a selection of colors or you allow people to pick freely, and as you see down there, we're outputting the palettes into the console. These are all fairly common things that you might need in your app. On the slightly less practical side, you can also build games with D3. Now, I admit, there we go. Not great UX on this because these grab handles are very small. But again, super simple demo, proof of concept, there we go. This is 100% D3. And I'm not using slides as such today, but I will be publishing these so you don't have to try to catch the URLs as they go past. You can go back, look at the code. Another very simple example. This is intensely data-driven. Contrast on that's pretty low. Can everybody actually see it? Okay. So, they're taking a large amount of data. In this case, they're pulling it out of natural earth. There's a little manipulation going on. They're calculating land area and removing many of the smallest countries. So yeah, we're into 100 territories. And then it throws them at you one at a time. And, okay, Belarus is, oh, I actually got that right. Or to make it a little harder if you're really confident about your geography. Again, very simple example, probably went together pretty quickly, taking an existing data set and turning it into this little edge game. For something a little more impressive, though, I'm going to reload this one. This game is being released by another one of the contributors. This is by far the most impressive animation set I have seen done with D3. It is being released in chapters, and sadly, it's not yet finished. I'm waiting for it to be fully released before I start playing it. But some really beautiful animations. Notice you've got filtering going on here in the background. The whole thing's an SVG. This is, that's Vasir.net, I think. Yes, VASIR.net. And Eric has a lot of material on there, really specifically talking about D3 and games. So if that's something you're interested in getting into, or if you're interested in creating very complex experiences like this, immersive experiences, I absolutely recommend you go and read his stuff. That's ENOEX on Twitter. Again, I'll have all of that stuff posted. Now, less exciting, you know, perhaps. But of course, data bits, reporting and intelligence. It's critical. It's pretty much got to be a category of its own. We pretty much talked about static data already. You take your set. Ideally, jumping back, Stephanie showed you some of the layouts that are selected for you. You can choose a layout, choose some parameters, and you can be up and running very quickly. Dynamic data, now that's a little more interesting. So as you feed it in combination with something like Meteor, something like React, something that will be pushing that through for you, you can easily push live reporting to your users. It's fairly trivial to build things that allow people to select custom data sets. Filtering becomes very fast and very performant. Flexible axes. You can allow people to select chart types. You can allow people to do analysis on the fly. The number one place where you're going to see this, of course, is the Times. In this upcoming season, probably 538, because they're consistently pushing the boundaries of how to display data, how to make it interesting. Honestly, that's one of the places I watch because they're conducting a lot of background research on user experience, how those images affect people's emotions, how they affect people's opinions. Ultimately, how that information is taken up and integrated into someone's worldview. And appropriately handling data, how to best display information, how to accurately get your point across, is something I could go on about for several more hours, but we're at 8:30 now, so we're going to leave that for another time. And does anyone have any questions for Stephanie or I about D3? Okay, we either
into silence.
We either put them to sleep or we covered everything. Thank you all.